So, hello everyone, and welcome to week 7 of Introduction to American Studies. This is our second week of the new unit, Unit 2, in which we're adding a focus on gender and sexuality to our focus from Unit 1, which was on race and ethnicity. So remember, you're now answering 2 reflection questions each week. The first is the usual question about how the reading challenges or expands your understanding of America. And the second is about how the author uses an intersectional approach, right? Which means how do they incorporate multiple aspects of identity or discrimination into their analysis. And this can include race, gender, sexuality, class, citizenship, ability, etc. Of course, this unit is focusing on gender and sexuality, so we'll expect that most of the authors will be, at the very least, incorporating those aspects into their analysis. And I'm only expecting a sentence or 2 for this, so this is not, an elaborate extension of your reflection. Your total reflection should still be to the same kind of length and word count as before. And if you're struggling with this concept, make sure that you've watched the Kimberly Crenshaw video on intersectionality at the beginning of the unit, and that you've also watched the beginning of my lecture from last week. And if you have any more questions, please do feel free to email me, and we can also set up a time to chat. So of all of the readings this semester, this week's reading is actually the closest to the kind of work that I do. Looking at the role of collective memory in fighting for and against racial justice. And I chose it primarily because it sheds light on the very public fights over Confederate monuments that have escalated over the past few months. And this reading shows how these fights are nothing new, and in fact African Americans have opposed these monuments since even before they were first erected. And this reading also shows how African American women played a central role in the battle over public monuments, and they not only opposed racist monuments, but also supported their own monuments that portrayed African Americans in a more empowered, dignified light. And just to situate us in time, Johnson's article is describing the same era that Khalil Gibran Muhammad's book did, which we read a chapter from a few weeks ago. So we're talking about a few decades after the Civil War, so basically the early 20th century, when the federal government has basically stopped protecting African Americans' rights, and southern states have been reinstituting white supremacy by suppressing the black vote, by segregating public spaces, and by lynching black people who challenge the new order, which becomes known as Jim Crow. And so this is the moment in the early 20th century when most of these Confederate monuments were going up. So they were a part of reinstituting white supremacy across the South by portraying Confederate soldiers as heroes fighting for the lost cause of the Civil War. Right, and the idea of the lost cause is, right, that the Civil War was a righteous struggle to defend this Southern way of life, right? And that the North was, unfairly, right, destroying the Southern way of life. But of course, this Southern way of life was based on plantation slavery and the oppression of black people. But Johnson's article isn't about monuments to Confederate soldiers. So that's all sort of the background, and that's happening at this moment of time. But Johnson actually writes about a proposed monument to enslaved black people, in particular to the Black Mammy. Well, why would white Southerners want to erect a monument to black people in this era? Well, a key part of this lost cause story, right, that Southerners used and some still use to defend the Confederacy is the absurd idea that black people were actually happy being enslaved and were better off under slavery. So in this interpretation of the Civil War, the Confederacy was actually fighting not to oppress black people, but actually to protect them. So Johnson focuses on a campaign for a monument to one of these allegedly happy slaves called the Black Mammy. And here is where gender comes into play. So under slavery, enslaved black women basically raised white children who grew up on plantations. And white people often referred to these women as their mammy. So the Black Mammy is sort of the idea of all of these enslaved black women throughout the South who are responsible for raising all of these white children. And so Johnson writes about how a group of Southern white women who were part of an organization that still exists called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they decided that there should be a national monument dedicated to all of their black mammies, and that this monument would therefore represent the happy, enslaved black women who so nobly took care of their children before the Civil War. And Johnson shows how, in response, black women, in particular members of an organization called the National Association of Colored Women, vehemently objected to this monument because they knew that they were not better off under slavery, or their parents and grandparents had not been better off under slavery. And they knew that they and their ancestors had not eagerly taken care of white women's children under these exploitative conditions. And on the contrary, right, they wanted to celebrate their ability as free women to take care of their own children and their own households. And so not only did they oppose the Black Mammy Monument, but they also raised money to support their own monuments. And in particular, Johnson talks about Frederick Douglass's home, Cedar Hill. So after the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass passed away, members of the National Association of Colored Women raised money to preserve his home, which was in Washington, D.C. And Johnson argues that even though this home was, of course, the home of a famous black man, that these women were preserving the home itself as a symbol of the domestic sphere of housework that's generally taken care of by women, right? So even though, when we get to sort of the feminism of the sort of mid-20th century, right, of the 1960s, 1970s, and we think about women rejecting, right, their role as having to take care of the home, right, or having to raise children, right, in this era, for black women to be able, right, to take care of their own home and to be able to raise their own children was actually a sign of their freedom, right, because prior they had been forced, right, to take care of white women's homes and children. And of course these dynamics continue well after the Civil War, and even to this day, right, there's dynamics of racial inequality in terms of who is a nanny, right, and who can hire a nanny. So it's not that these dynamics have disappeared, but there's this particular moment, right, in these decades in the early 20th century, right, where black women are seizing the opportunity, right, to be mothers, right, to be homemakers as a sign of freedom. So overall, Johnson shows how the United Daughters of the Confederacy promoted the reinstitution of racial injustice after the Civil War by proposing this monument to an allegedly happy enslaved black woman, while the National Association of Colored Women promoted progress towards racial justice by preserving Douglass's home as a symbol of free black womanhood and motherhood. So in terms of this idea of intersectionality, right, you can hopefully see how both race and gender are central to Johnson's analysis, right? Black and white women had very different perspectives on the relationship between race and gender, particularly motherhood. So white women saw black women's motherhood as a resource for them to exploit for their own purposes, while black women saw their own motherhood as a sign of their own freedom and dignity and respectability. So thinking about question 2, right, Johnson is using an intersectional approach in that she looks at both race and gender and how they shape these battles over monuments. But she isn't, however, looking at other aspects of identity, like class. So she's not looking at how working class women might have viewed monuments differently than middle class women, which might be an interesting thing to look at as well. So I basically just gave you an answer to question 2 for this week, so you can go back a few seconds and write that down if you want. And overall, Johnson shows how these debates regarding collective memory are so important because they're a form of public education, right? These monuments and historic homes and whatnot are ways of publicly and permanently telling stories about what America is about and who America is for. And so I hope this reading sheds light on these contemporary public debates, and you can see why these Confederate monuments are so controversial and how they have been opposed since before they even went up in the early 20th century. As usual, your reflection and discussion board posts are due by Sunday at midnight. And don't forget to actually answer question 2 about intersectionality. I'll see you next week.